Okay, it's the bottom of the hour, so I'm going to get started now. My name is Steve Cruz. I'm a director for Clango. Clango is in the cybersecurity and identity business, and we think it's very appropriate to talk about identity as a component of cybersecurity, particularly with movement for a lot of organizations to cloud. So today's presentation, we're going to be talking about cloud and identity, and what we'd like to share with you what we think is important and some of the developments that have taken place over the last several years. Unfortunately, we won't have a live Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so if you do have questions, there's a couple ways to get questions to us, and we're happy to answer them. One way is just shoot an email to info, I-N-F-O, @clango.com. Clango is C-L-A-N-G-O. Or you could send it directly to me. My name's Steve Cruz. My email is skruse@clango.com. Either way, we'll try to answer any and all questions you might have. So let me dive into the presentation because we have a lot to cover, and we've only have about a half hour for this webinar. I'm going to jump to the next slide here. And sorry, let me see if I can go back there. Kind of double-clicked. And talk about what we've learned over the last few years. This cloud adoption work that's been done has been going on for at least the last half a dozen years. We're going to talk a little bit about that just to tee up the conversation. And we're going to talk about some of the gaps that were already identified back in the, say, 2011, 2012 timeframe when cloud popularity really kind of first began. And then we're going to talk about maybe some new issues that have occurred over the last several years that we've seen since this migration or this cloud adoption work. We're also going to talk about the focus is really cybersecurity in cloud, and as part of that cybersecurity effort, really our focus, and in some ways maybe rightfully so, is a bit of an identity management focus, since a lot of the prior cybersecurity tools may or may not be available to us when we move a lot of our services over to cloud. So let me go through some of these slides with you now. Historically, what we've seen, of course, for traditional cloud adoption is that this is very attractive to organizations for multiple reasons. One of the major reasons is cash flow. Instead of big capital investments in servers and data centers and things like that, perhaps we can just spend our money on a subscription or a monthly type of basis in order to get some kind of services or platform availability for us and for our organization in a cloud environment. So we can see some advantages from a hardware and data center cost, as well as perhaps a basic OS administration costs and patching costs that could really be outsourced or delegated to our cloud provider or providers. So typically, you know, what we see is savings there on some of these deployment costs as part of cloud adoption, of course. What still is a component, a cost for organizations, though, would be things like integrations, would be things like customizations, would be things like expert consulting. So although there are some financial advantages for moving to cloud, these are still kinds of issues that we need to kind of look at when we're moving some of our services to cloud-based systems. Part of the work here is really this kind of notion of balancing the scale in terms of how much configuration or customization we need versus out-of-the-box kind of features of say, an application as a service or a SaaS type of model, software as a service type of model. So we see these kind of balancing between adoption, adaption, standardized, customized, speed to market versus company differentiation, et cetera. And historically, this might have been kind of considered sufficient kind of analysis for cloud-based decisions. But obviously, even back a half a dozen years ago or more, there were some cybersecurity issues that aren't really considered on this slide that need to be reviewed and looked at. So we'll talk a bit about, we'll talk more about that. Some of the things that we saw a couple of years ago, back in 2016, was that roughly 80% or 79% of enterprises are actively deploying some kind of cloud solutions. And the bar chart over on the right side of the slide is really talking about what services are being looked at for cloud. email, customer data, sales and marketing, employee data, et cetera. So a lot of these enterprises were shifting and are shifting workload from on-prem to cloud-based solutions. That number has actually gone up from 79%. Now we're seeing numbers from recent studies at about 85 or 86%. So actually cloud adoption is actually been accelerating over the last couple of years. With this, though, of course, there's a shift in the concept of a security perimeter. We can no longer think of, our infrastructure as kind of like the old kind of castle analogy of using the cyber fences like firewalls and things to protect our organization. So there's this shift in the concept of a security perimeter. In this study that was done a couple of years ago, back in 2016, the vast majority of the respondents did have some concerns about cloud security. There was only a small percentage, or 14%, that believed that some of their traditional security tools might be effective in the cloud. And a lot of the security companies back a few years ago had really failed to attempt to cloudize, I suppose, their security solutions. I don't know if that's a word or not, but these were some reports done back in 2016, not that long ago. So where does this leave us? The other advantages of cloud adoption was this kind of move from capital expenditures to operational expenditures. And but with this security concerns, there's been the shift of interest from the chief financial officer, information officer, to a security officer or chief information security officer. As part of that, really, there has been an increased emphasis on those services, those security services we use to make sure that our information systems have the requisite security they need in order for us to maintain confidentiality and availability. So as part of that, this identity management processes and programs have really moved from kind of a nice-to-have feature to really a must-have feature. So other vendors have really talked about identity as the new control plane for services as we're looking to third-party, to cloud-based vendors to manage a lot of our services. Compounding the issue is the fact that the trust models are getting increasingly tricky. So now we have kind of these shared responsibility models where some of the responsibility for the security falls still on us as enterprise owners and managers, whereas other elements of the trust model are, let's say, outsourced to the cloud vendors and managed through, say, service level agreements or some kind of contractual kind of management. But that identity data in and of itself is kind of getting more and more tricky as well with some of the privacy mandates. Obviously, the GDPR mandate out of Europe, which is coming out in just a couple of weeks now, or enforced in just a couple of weeks now, is getting making it a lot trickier for organizations. These boxes, kind of in the middle of the slide, are talking about, say, the on-premise apps we might have used, just a few years ago from Microsoft, from SAP, from Oracle. Really, a lot of those have moved to cloud-based apps as well, and they could be hosted by, say, a Microsoft or an Oracle or other organizations. And then, of course, we have these applications running, maybe a Workday application for our human resources team, or Salesforce applications for our sales and marketing teams. The other thing that compounds the issue is the fact that our employees, our customers, and our partners are using social media credentials for some of their work, possibly. So if I have credentials on Twitter or Facebook or Google or LinkedIn, these credentials sometimes are used for us to allow prospects and customers into our hosted offerings, our catalogs, our sales systems, but also our employees or our vendors might be using these social media credentials, assuming we allow that, to access some of our systems. So it's yet one more thing that we need to kind of consider when we're looking at security in and around the cloud. if we just take a kind of a simple look, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because this is probably obvious to most in the audience, we can think about cloud security in a couple of different ways, right? We can think about security for applications. So when we talk about, say, these applications as a service, like a Salesforce type application, we have to consider things like access, what are we storing on the cloud, and how are we transmitting that data in the cloud. We can also look at security from the platform. So if we're looking at infrastructure as a service, IaaS, or platform as a service, PaaS, we still have some level in the stack that the cloud vendor might be responsible for, but we also have some responsibility for our applications and our data there. And finally, we also see this kind of move for security vendors to provide security services from the cloud. So we see SOCs, or security operations centers, as a service. We see security information and event management, SIEM, as a service that vendors are now offering from the cloud. So there's this general move, of course, from network and perimeter-centric security to data and identity-centric. And some of the concerns are things like shadow IT. This is, you're probably familiar, is this kind of notion of other departments beyond our IT department, perhaps acquiring services from cloud vendors without the approval or the sanction from the IT or the information security team. We worked on a local project out here where a utility company had about 78 different cloud services that the IT team didn't know about. So this is not atypical or uncommon, the fact that other departments or divisions in the organization might, just for speed of access, might be trying to get some services available and not going through the sanction channels to get those kind of approvals or reviews. Beyond the shadow IT issues, of course, there's data issues, what's stored, transferred, downloaded, or shared, and the threats. So how do we detect threats that are perhaps relevant to critical assets and even those non-critical assets? If we look at a traditional cloud adoption pattern, we can see that historically, the chief information officer might be responsible for enterprise applications, for infrastructure, for general services and shared services like Microsoft Exchange for an email service, HR for HR database, sales for productivity apps, and operations for other databases. And as we move from cloud, we see, those responsibilities moving from these on-premise applications over to cloud-based applications. And that's all well and good, and there's some strong advantages to that. But, what we see that's kind of missing from this equation is this notion of review from our information security team typically. Historically, what we've seen is the information security team might have some kind of identity management solution in place, either directory-based or otherwise, that's managing these on-prem applications. And that's a very good thing. That's perfectly fine. But obviously, we need to kind of extend those solutions of provisioning, access request workflows, self-service, out to these cloud-based solutions as well. So this is an area that a lot of organizations are really bumping into now, is to kind of how to handle both those on-prem applications and services as well as the cloud-based services. So we kind of hear users talking about issues with, say, access to the various cloud services. There's some notion of identity fragmentation where users have credentials for the cloud services as well as corporate credentials, and there might be difficulty managing these multiple credentials, not only from the user perspective, but how does the organization kind of understand this when we're dealing with, say, multiple cyber identities. So these are some of the challenges that we've been running into the last several years. Another way to kind of look at it is to try to understand, okay, well, what typically have we seen in this on-premise world? And that's really depicted by this kind of building picture over on the left side of the slide. And then some of the security services that might be required in a cloud-based world. So API management, web firewalls, again, the security, information and event management, cloud access security brokers, user behavior analytics, secure web gateway. So there's these additional services, security services that may be required in the cloud, and we already see a lot of information security teams that have some kind of point solution fatigue where they're already managing an inordinate amount of products and devices and solutions. And now we're burdening that team to maybe take a look at yet additional solutions in order to properly manage the security within the cloud environment. So this is becoming a really challenging kind of issue for information security, cybersecurity teams that we've seen for some of our customers. A recent report that's come out by Oracle lists some of the cloud threats that we've been seeing over the last few years. Some of these are a little bit older, but we can talk about them. Let me touch really quickly on some of these. There was an issue with a very large insurance company, had a fraud cybersecurity event where one of their accountants had excessive permissions, and she was able to purchase goods using the corporate funds. Some of these were luxury goods, and it was a significant amount. And in order to cover her tracks, she actually had credentials for some of her coworkers. So she was able to log in as some of her coworkers and erase some log files so that her actions in terms of doing some of this fraudulent work were not able to be detected for some time. It turned out to be a significant amount of money for this financial or insurance company. Another example are some spear phishing attacks that occurred. There was one incident where direct deposit funds were transferred to another account. In that case, it only cost about $15,000, which I don't mean to trivialize it, but not a lot of money. But it cost several orders of magnitude in order to fix this issue. And in this case, it was $1.5 million to fix the issue. Several years ago, back in 2015, the Office of Personnel Management at the federal government level had an issue with probably a nation state attacking some of their cybersecurity systems. One of the interesting parts was that what was compromised in part for them was their jump hosts. So these are the hosts that, generally speaking, should be highly secured because we're gonna really leverage those jump hosts to jump to other systems within our organizations that might not have the required level of security that we need for compliance or other reasons. The other interesting part was this was discovered, I believe it was April 15th of 2015. And the gentleman that identified this found that there was a lot of activity going to a machine that was in another domain. In this case, the domain was opm.org, but it turned out that .org domain name wasn't even registered to the Office of Personnel Management, and it had been registered roughly a year earlier, back in April of 2014. So this kind of attack had been taking place for some time. The fourth bullet, data exposure, talks about the fact that AWS or Amazon Web Services, and Amazon's not the only cloud-based service in which this is occurring, but they're one of the most popular, has this notion of buckets or storage repositories for information. And if I, as a user of these, configure these as public buckets, that means that really they're exposed to anyone who wants to take a look inside of there. And if I'm working obviously with sensitive data, then that sensitive data is being exposed. The issue that really compounds this problem is the fact that there are automated tools now to really go around and look into these public buckets to see what's happening in there. And so these automated tools can very quickly and efficiently interrogate these Amazon AWS environments to see if there are any public buckets, and if there are, what data might be in there. So there's been multiple cases of administrators or developers using these buckets in an unsecured fashion, and having some sensitive data exposed. This is a relatively new event, meaning, we see more and more of this over the last, say, 3 to 5 years. And finally, this cloud ransom. There was a notion of an incident of state voter database where there was 19 million voter identities that were leaked online and then later held ransom. And more recently, of course, there's been other state and local governments where this has occurred. Some issues in the Connecticut government. There was an issue in Atlanta about a month ago. Montgomery County, Alabama, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina were other victims of some ransomware attacks recently. One of the challenges is how do we enforce policy if we're in the information security team and we're looking to protect our information? And an example might be that perhaps my users are using a public storage application like Dropbox, let's say, and as a way to get into that Dropbox repository, I'm using some credentials that I've generated on my own from, say, Google or something. So now I've got my social credentials logging into Dropbox to store some information, but in fact that information could be owned by my company, by my enterprise. And so the challenge, of course, is where does an IT department or an information security department enforce that policy, right? Are they going to restrict me from having my social credentials, my social identities? That hardly seems like a practical solution. Could they restrict me from accessing Dropbox or using Dropbox as a repository? Well, certainly at a policy level they could, but technically speaking, it's a really challenging kind of issue for a lot of cybersecurity teams that are working on these kinds of things right now. So this is one of those examples of challenges or issues that we're running into and working through. Another point example is what's going on in terms of some of the new cyber attacks. So we talked about ransomware a slide or two ago. Another one would be this kind of notion of Trojan horse. We've actually seen some occurrences where in some cases somebody was hired in an organization, but the person hired in the organization really had no intent of working for a long time for the organization. And in fact, from a cyber risk kind of perspective, could be thought of as a bad actor. So this agent was hired, but this agent had full intentions of trying to compromise information for financial gain from an organization. So in one case, an agent like this was hired. That agent then stole credentials in the organization and intentionally corrupted a master database within the organization. If any of you on the webinar here have ever kind of worked through corrupted databases, you know that it's a non-trivial exercise to sometimes restore these things. So during the restoration process, some privileges were elevated in order to properly do the restoration, but once those privileges were elevated, and in this case the bad actor had access to those credentials, routing numbers were changed, fake vendors were created, other issues happened. And so after the restoration was completed, then fraudulent vendor payments were made, and those payments were made for millions of dollars, and the company kind of realized too late what had happened in this particular case. So a lot of these different kind of threats, and we've known about threats like Trojan horse threats for many years now, have really kind of come up again in this cloud-based world. We've talked before about the fact that focusing on the cloud platform is not the only concern when you're dealing with operations, and there needs to be this focus on identity, and it might not just be identity provisioning, but really the full identity life cycle. So we might have to do some authorization checks and other assurances that these identities are who they say they are, and they have the proper roles, and there's some attestations involved. Beyond that, we have to be concerned with availability and service level agreements. We have to perhaps use those identities across platforms. and that includes maybe the authentication, perhaps access management and authorizing entitlements. And oftentimes we might need to do some identity monitoring as warranted for, say, high-value assets or privileged accounts. And again, we have this notion of on-premise apps, cloud-based apps, as well as social credentials and social services that are complicating the picture. The other things beyond social media that makes identity management challenging are other major trends in technology. So we all know big data and analytics is a major trend in technology. Mobility has been a major trend for the last, say, dozen years or so. And one of the attractions of a cloud-based service is the fact that my employees might be able to then access with their portable devices, their mobile devices if appropriate. And then the Internet of Things, the fact that, we now have smart homes, smart factory floors, smart devices, and so a lot more Internet accessible devices than we had a dozen or more years ago. And that problem is really compounding some of the issues. But we see kind of a commonality with all of these trends taking place, and that is that they do all have some notion of identity. And so we really have to focus on, are we doing identity properly for our cloud, as well as are we managing the identity properly within the cloud kind of thing. So this again makes our work as cybersecurity professionals just that much more challenging. So one way that we've seen customers succeed and work on providing some of the requisite security for the cloud migration is that they might have their traditional security solutions, but they might also be adopting some cloud-based services like Cloud Access Security Broker, like Cloud Identity Management, like Secure Transaction Policy Enforcement, like a Cloud Security Information and Event Management System. But in order to kind of reduce the burden of managing the point solutions, oftentimes they're able to use some kind of security orchestration to tie these kinds of technologies into something like a security dashboard or a single pane of glass to manage these things from a central location or a central console. We've worked, Clango, have worked with several companies now where we're doing these kinds of services for some of our customers. That's really the presentation. We could get more into detail about some of the solutions with you if you have any interest. You can look to Clango for some of our identity cloud services offerings. We provide security services for these various issues. And we actually have a free whiteboard session that if your organization is interested, we could come in and provide a simple, say, 2 or 4 hour kind of session with yourself and your AD or your directory experts to understand and analyze what issues you might be wrestling with in terms of identity and cloud migration. Thank you very much. As I said before, if you have any questions, you can email myself or info@clango.com, and we're happy to try to answer any questions for you.